Okay, thought I'd do just a quick composting basic video for somebody that I'm trying to help a little bit. And when I say this is basic, I mean this is going to be as high level and as basic as possible. There is so much information available if you want to get into it a little bit deeper. County extension agents and offices have got tons of information for free. Websites, I've probably got 8 different books just on composting. But for those who may not have ever gardened whatsoever and really don't know anything at all, I'm hoping just to kind of give you just a little snack. That's an appetizer is all it is. Anyway, the what, where, when, what, when, where, why, and how. First of all, what is composting? Very basically, composting is decomposition. You can call it rotting, you can call it breaking down, decaying, putrefying. To some degree, it's all the same thing. If it's animal or vegetable, you know, walks around, swims, flies, or has roots, it can be composted. Now, there are some things that, well, it can be composted. All of it can be. But for our purposes, there are a few things that we probably do not want to compost and use, especially around plants where other humans are going to be. But that's going to get beyond the scope of this. We can get into that later. You can look that up. But again, if it's animal or vegetable, it can be composted. Metal can't be composted. It oxidizes. So we got a picture of just some kitchen scraps here on the left, and you've got a little handful of compost being put around some kind of possibly a bean plant of some kind or something on the right hand side. So the start and the finish. Where can you compost? Composting happens anywhere. I mean, we've already talked about what is composting. It's decay. So if you've got something on the kitchen table or on the countertop in a bowl you forget about, or and it starts to rot, well, it's composting. So obviously you can compost anywhere. You can compost inside. We just talked about that on the countertop. It's not where you want it, but it does happen there. And outside. What you see, the two pictures, the one on the left is what's called a composting toilet. And basically it's just a bucket you poop and pee into, and the little box with the lid up there is some kind of dry material like wood shavings or leaves that have been, shredded down extremely fine. Some very fine, absorbent, dry kind of material that you then place on top of whatever you deposited. And over time that will begin to compost. And when you do it correctly, there's very little, if any, smell as well. And then you just take that bucket out, and that would go into a separate kind of composting pile. They have a name for that. It's called humanure. It's manure from a humanure. But I mean, it can be as small as that or as large as what you see on the next picture, which is probably, I'm guessing, 3 to 5 acres. And all that dark stuff piled up is compost, and they row it up and keep air in there, and they'll turn it over. And then they turn around and sell that for quite a bit of money. Some municipalities, some cities actually do composting, and then you can go and get it for free by the truckload to keep it from going to landfill. Okay, where can I compost, or when can I compost? Anytime. Okay, we've already talked about you can have something that's been left in the refrigerator for 2 years and it's got all fungus on it and mold and stuff like that. It's actually composting. This is doing it extremely slow because it's in the refrigerator. You see a picture here, and you have a pile of wood chips, shredded trees and limbs and stuff in the dead of winter with snow on the ground, and you see the steam coming off of it. That tells you it is composting. It is breaking down in that big pile. It happens day or night, summer or winter. It's always happening. So some of the things, you see the one down here where it's creating the steam, obviously that's a lot of heat. What are some things you can do with that heat? There are people who will use it to kind of help raise the temperature of a small greenhouse a little bit. Um, Try to get things started early or keep things going later. There have even been lots of designs and experiments done, and people sometimes will use it. They'll put coils of piping or hose or something in the middle of that pile, and as the water goes through it, it absorbs that heat, and you heat water for showers for the household or something. If it's a big enough pile, done correctly, you may be able to let it sit there for up to 3 months, and that whole 3 months it may not be getting as hot as your regular hot water heater and doing as much, but it will heat water for as long as there's heat in that pile, and you can pump the water through. Why would you want to compost? Okay, whether we're doing just a little bit or we're doing huge, that industrial scale. The industrial scale, obviously they're doing it for profit, but there may be some other reasons too. But the most common reason people compost is to create fertilizer. Okay, rather than going to the store and buying a bag of those little white, granules and stuff that comes from oil. It's really kind of strange how we actually try to feed our plants oil, but that's what we do. But if you don't want to do that, you create your own fertilizer. Those granular stuff typically will have three things. You'll see on the front, it'll have N, P, and K: nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, those three numbers. And that may be pretty much all that's in there, and maybe just a trace of some other stuff or something to kind of bulk it up so that it's easier to spread. But that's mainly what's in there. But where's all the other stuff? Where's all the micronutrients, the magnesium, the manganese, the niacin, all the other things that are needed for a healthy plant? Well, compost can do all of that, and it's a slow release. All that granular stuff is what they call water soluble. As soon as it rains on it, it dissolves and goes into the soil. But then when it rains again, it goes deeper in the soil. When it rains again, and you lose a very high portion of all that money that you spent on that oil to put on the ground. It just either runs off in a heavy rain or it soaks down and gets below the roots, and it's doing you no good. And it does it very quickly, so you have to reapply it. That's why in potted plants and a lot of stuff like this, you'll see them saying to fertilize them, add some kind of fertilizer, every week or every 2 weeks or something like that. You're constantly having to do that. The compost is going to be a slow release, so you can put it on there like once a year, and you've fertilized the garden or whatever you're trying to fertilize for a whole year. Very slow. Maybe you want to reduce what goes into the landfill. I mean, you saw those piles and piles. I look around my little community here, and the limbs and the leaves and all this kind of stuff, and all the kitchen scraps that are in those wheeled totes that the truck picks up and dumps. I mean, there's tons and tons of stuff that's going to go into a landfill, and it's going to rot. It's going to compost down in the landfill, mixed with TVs and blankets and who knows, toys, plastic, all kinds of stuff. It's going to do nobody any good. So if we can keep it out of the landfill, then we might be able to use it somewhere else. Perhaps you want to reduce the use of chemicals and petroleum products on your land. We've already talked about that. Perhaps you want to enrich in the soil. Here's a funny thing about compost, and it breaks down into something that they call humus, not hummus. You eat that, but humus. Compost fixes almost everything when it comes to the land. If you've got heavy, heavy clay soil that will not drain whatsoever, add compost and it will start to drain better. It may take a little while, but the better it's mixed in there, it will drain better. It will have more nutrients. If you've got completely the opposite of clay and you've got completely sand, I mean, you pour water on it and it's just gone. It leaves so fast. Well, it won't hold any water. Well, if you add compost, if you add humus to it, it will actually absorb like a sponge some of that water and hold it in place. So regardless of which degree or which side of the teeter-totter your soil is, humus or compost will fix it. If you need nutrients, compost will fix that. And since it's a slow release, You don't have to, have a perfect chemical analysis of it to know how much. You just put it there, and the plants will take what they need, and the rest of it will hang around until that plant or another plant needs it. So it just kind of hangs there like a savings account. Um, and for some of us that are kind of weird, it can be for enjoyment and for learning. There are so many different ways to compost, different methods, different compositions, different techniques, different scales. Do you want bucket size? Do you want it acre sized? Do you want to try to do a very, very hot compost? Do you want to try to do a cold compost? Do you want to, just so many different ways of doing it, and then being able to use it can be an enjoyable thing in and of its own as a part of gardening or a part of. Now, how to compost? Well, let's see. We could just pile some stuff up and just leave it. If you've ever cleared land, if you had dug something out, done some yard work, whatever, and just made a big pile of stuff back in the back corner and said, I'll get to that later, and then 5 years later you haven't gotten to it, but you notice it's not the pile that you started with. Now it's a pile of dirt instead of a pile of leaves and limbs. Well, you just composted. Just did it very slowly. We could bury some stuff and leave it. People do that all the time. They're clearing land. They dig a big pit. They take all the tree trunks and all that kind of stuff, and they bury it. A landfill. I mean, that's what we're doing. We're burying the stuff and leaving it. All kinds of ways, and you can do that on purpose for certain ways. We can pile some stuff up and mix it or turn it. And that's what you're seeing actually to some degree in the middle one. They've made those pallets, and I'm sure they go in there occasionally and will turn that into a new pile or something like that. When you turn it, basically what you're doing is you're speeding the process up. You're mixing the ingredients, you're adding air, you're adding water, and just speeding it up so that you can use it faster. So that maybe you can use it in 3 to 6 months on the garden someplace or the yard someplace, rather than in a year to 2 years. We can give it to some animals. The chickens, you see the chickens there, they're digging around in that, helping break it down. They'll poop in there, adding nitrogen, and just kind of helping you out. Worms, I mean, it's called vermicomposting. You pile your stuff in there and let the worms eat it. And then all that black stuff is called worm castings or worm poop. And that's used as a fertilizer, a very high dollar fertilizer. I think it's like, I don't know, $20 for a 2-pound bag of just worm castings or worm poop. You can even do it just in the tote that you see on the right hand side there, so it doesn't have to be a big outdoor pile. You can just have a tote like this with some holes in it for drainage and for air next to your back door, and as your kitchen scraps, you just put them in there, and little by little it'll compost down. So quick compost recipe. Okay, while it really, to some degree, it doesn't matter what you put in there and in what ratios, there if you want it to work well and work fairly fast, is kind of a recipe. First of all, you have to kind of divide anything that you're thinking about putting in there into 2 categories. There's carbon and nitrogen. And sometimes that can sound a little too scientific, a little too, academic or something like that. So we can also think of it as crunchies and wets, or browns and greens. Let's start with the browns and greens. Okay, dry leaves are brown, they're crunchy, and that's carbon. So leaves would be crunchy brown carbon. Fresh grass clippings, they're wet, they're green, and that's nitrogen. Okay, if you've ever had a whole, got a riding lawnmower that bags as well, and you're cutting clover or something really, really green and wet kind of stuff, and if you were to pile all that up, in a trash can or maybe in those black bags or something like that, and you notice later in the day you go out there and it's hot. Well, if it's in the black bags out in the sun, a little bit of that heat is from the sun, but most of that is from the nitrogen and the bacteria eating the nitrogen in all that and heating it up. So nitrogen is going to be hot. Think about that. chicken litter, if you've ever cleaned out a chicken coop and all the chicken poop and stuff, extremely high in nitrogen. You pile that up, it's going to get hot in a hurry. Okay, so wet grass clippings, it's going to be wet, green, and nitrogen. Now, it doesn't have to be green to be a green. Coffee grounds, wet coffee grounds, even dry ones, but once you add moisture to them, it's going to be wet. It is nitrogen, but it's not green. But for our purpose, if it's high in nitrogen, it's called a green. So wet coffee grounds are going to be a green. Newspaper, not the glossy advertising stuff, but just the regular newsprint. It's going to be a crunchy brown carbon. Cardboard, crunchy brown carbon. Okay, so we've got carbon, nitrogen, crunchy wet, brown green, whatever you want to use, but those are the kind of the two categories. Now the ratio is going to be the golden ratio, you might say, is about 30-1, meaning you'd have to put a whole lot of leaves and not a whole lot, and not very much coffee grounds, fresh grass clippings, or chicken poop. If you really wanted to get into it, you'd have to look up some of the tables or websites that show you how much carbon and nitrogen is already in that thing. So like grass clippings, I think, are automatically 20-1. So they're pretty close. They will compost down pretty quick if you do nothing but have a pile of those. But you can add some paper to it. You can add some grass clippings and stuff in there to make it closer to that. Now, when we talk about adding leaves and paper and stuff like that, one thing to remember is in order for it to break down faster, they need to be smaller pieces. So just raking up leaves whole and putting them in a pile, that's going to take a long time to break down because they're such big pieces. And a lot of times they won't even stay very wet, because once you've got a pile, they're going to mat down and almost act like shingles on that top layer. And the stuff underneath it's never going to get wet. It's going to stay dry, and it'll just take forever for that to compost down, years sometimes. So if you can shred it up in some way, newspaper, put it through a shredder, even just by hand, takes a lot of effort that way. Leaves, put it through like one of those blowers that you can reverse, and it sucks it up and shreds it. Run the lawnmower over it a whole bunch of times before you vacuum it up and put it in the compost pile. Give it to the chickens; they'll shred it up over 2 or 3 months. But smaller bits, the closer to sawdust or to just little bitty confetti pieces, it will compost down a whole lot faster. Okay, do you have to mix them? No. They will get mixed. If you put it in a pile and give it the water and leave it alone, it will eventually compost down. If you do turn it, it will just happen faster, because you've got a lot of bacteria that's doing the majority of the breaking down. Bacteria, worms, ants, larvae, all kinds of other critters are going to be in there. But bacteria does the vast majority of it, and it's what creates all the heat in some of the piles. So the more you mix it up, the more you got the balance right, then they will just compost it better. Composting, I mean, the bacteria, the worms, all that kind of stuff, they're alive. Okay, so anything that's alive needs nutrition, and the good bacteria that we want needs oxygen. There's some bacteria that does not need oxygen, and there's some that does. What we would consider the bad bacteria, or the ones that's less desirable, that does not need oxygen, you'll know that's happening because it stinks. Okay, if it stinks, it smells funky like that old gray muck at the bottom of the pond. That's the non-oxygen bacteria working there. If it smells like soil, if it smells kind of earthy, that's the bacteria that is using the oxygen. So we mix it to get oxygen in there. Okay, the pile needs to breathe the way we need to breathe, get oxygen in and blow the bad stuff off. It also needs water. You can use tap water, municipal water. It's not the best thing in the world, because municipal water has been treated to be safe for us to drink, which means the bacteria is out. How do you get the bacteria out of it? Well, you filter it, and you put chlorine and other chemicals that kill the bacteria. Well, if there's enough chlorine and stuff in the water to kill the bacteria in the water to make it safe for you to drink, it's going to kill the bacteria also in the pile. So um, you can use that. It's just, it may slow things down a little bit. If you have to use it and you've got time, put it in some kind of a large container, let it sit for a couple of days, let all that chlorine evaporate off, and then use it. Rainwater is best. Rainwater is going to be the best thing for it. But there's got to be some moisture in there. How much? Well, you don't want it to be dripping wet. You want it, if you take a sponge and you wring all the water out, and you've got a sponge to the point that when you really squeeze it hard, you get 1 or 2 drops. That's about how much water. So if you pick up some of this, whatever you've got composting in there, and you give it a good hard squeeze and you get about 1 or 2 drops, that's about the right amount of water. Okay. And then if it's heating up really good, that's why we may need to turn it later, give it some more oxygen, but also to see if it has dried out, it's burned off or evaporated all that water, and we may need to add a little bit more to it to keep it moist so that it can compost down. So we've already talked about mixing. Okay, how do you know that it's working? Okay, we piled all this stuff up. How do we know that it's doing anything? Well, first thing is it's going to start looking different. Either, in a month later, a couple of weeks later, you dig into it and it looks darker. It just looks different. That's one way you can tell. But if it's a big enough pile, if it's 2, 3, 4 feet tall, when you pile it up, it'll start shrinking. Okay, it's settling, the air is getting out of there, but as it breaks down and compost into smaller bits, it tends to shrink. Just in general, there's exceptions to all of this, but this is a high level one. So let's shrink. One of the best ways to tell what's going on in just your regular compost pile is the heat. This thermometer you see is one specifically for this kind of thing, and the probe, the metal thing that you stick into it, can be 2 or 3 feet long, okay, to really get down in the middle of that pile. And when you first pile it up over the next few days, depending on the situation, you'll see each day when you check it, it'll start getting warmer and warmer and warmer. The orange zone you see there from about 100 degrees Fahrenheit to about 130 degrees Fahrenheit is where you want it. Okay, that's probably one of the best zones, and it will climb up into that if you got the mixture and the water and everything right. And then over a few days, little by little, it'll start cooling down, cooling down, cooling down. When it gets down to the yellow, that's when a lot of people would go ahead and turn it again, and maybe add some more water and stuff like that, and kind of give it 2 or 3 cycles at least up in that orange zone. If it gets into the red zone, obviously it says it's hot, so it's hot. You may want that occasionally. If I'm piling a bunch of leaves and stuff from maybe my neighbor's yard that's got a lot of acorns in it, or I've got a lot of weeds in it. When I weed my garden, and I don't have to do a ton of weeding, but when I do weed it, I don't throw those weeds away. I put them in the compost pile. Well, I don't. They may have seeds from the weeds. Well, I don't want those to germinate, so I'll make sure that pile gets 1 or 2 good cycles up in that hot zone, and that's going to be hot enough over the course of 2 or 3 days to kill those weed seeds, so it effectively sterilizes it. So I don't have to worry about now taking that and putting that in the garden and having weeds come up, because I have killed them with the heat. Also, I have chickens. When I use my chicken litter, the chicken poop, when I clean out the chicken coop and stuff like that, and when I put that in there, it could have salmonella. It could have some pathogens in there that obviously I don't want to eat or get on me too much. So I will make sure that in any pile that I've put chicken litter in, and I use it to heat up the pile, because the chicken litter, the high nitrogen content in it is kind of like adding gasoline to a fire or adding oil to a fire. It makes it really hot, but that's necessary to kill the pathogens. So you pile it up, you see the temperature start climbing. If it doesn't get as high as you want it, then maybe it needs water, air, or more nitrogen. If it gets very hot, too hot, you might need to break it apart a little bit, let it cool down, keep it from overheating. Um, but you kind of watch it go up. It'll stay at that temperature for a few days, and then they'll start dropping down. So you can kind of tell that it's working. How hot can it get? There are many, many stories from back when lots of people had cattle and stuff and would put up hay. You had to be very careful about putting your hay up wet because, I mean, you would have a barn full, stacked full. I mean, we're talking, 60 feet wide, 60 feet tall, sometimes these big barns, just full of this organic material, this wet hay. And in the middle of that, it starts heating up. And if it gets hot enough, it would catch fire. So, yes, in huge, huge building size piles that are left unattended, it can get that hot. Your compost pile in the backyard is not going to catch fire. Don't worry about it. Anyway, okay. So, how do you know when it's done? Well, when you look at it and you can't tell what it used to be. So you've got this pile, you've got this bin, this garden garbage can that you're using to compost in. You've dumped in leaves, you've dumped in kitchen scraps, weeds, old vegetables, newspaper, whatever. You piled all that in there over the course of 3 to 6 months. And now when you dump it out or when you turn it, you can't tell what's what. You can't tell the newspaper from the lettuce leaves from the coffee grounds. It's done. Okay, you can use it before that, but at that point, it's done. Now, it's not going to look exactly what the stuff is that you buy at the Home Depot or something like that's been bagged, because a lot of that stuff they've sifted just for the really fine stuff to make it really pretty to sell to you and stuff like that. So yours might be a lot more chunky, but it's just as fine. It's just as good. What do you do with it now? Well, you spread it around. You put it where the plants are that you want to get a nice slow feeding of nutrients. If you've got some trees or you've got some place that you're having some grass and some weeds coming up, pile it 3 or 4 inches deep. Use it as a mulch, so it will mulch, suppress the weeds, and feed the plants that you're putting it around at the same time. If you've got it fine enough or have a way to sift it, you can start new plants in it from seed. So, if I've got some really good compost, it's nice and small, I may hang on to that. And then when I'm starting new tomatoes and stuff like that for my garden, instead of buying potting soil, I may use that. Sometimes in my garden beds, I will just spread the seed out on the bed, on the raised bed, and I don't poke it down in the soil. I don't till it in. I don't do anything else. I just lay the seed on top and then put the inch or 2 inches or however much, like on the seed packet, it says, plant this seed 2 inches deep. Okay, well, I just lay it on top of the ground and put 2 inches of compost over the top and I'm done. So that's what you use it for.